I'm Johan Vega, and here we are in our sound room in Holyoke Media at One Core Plaza, Holyoke, Massachusetts. I want to welcome Erika Slocumb, and we're going to talk about your most recent iteration of this long project that you have been working for years already, an amazing, fascinating, and important work on the Black history of Holyoke. And now it has even expanded to the region of Western Massachusetts with a focus centered in Holyoke. So, Erika, thank you so much for being here with us. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here.
First time here in Holyoke Media, although it's not the first time we have spoken about your work with Black Holyoke. And this time it is this new exhibit at Wistariahurst, which is the Reliquary of Blackness, Chapter 2. Mm-hmm. What has been the new additions of history, stories, and even physical pieces of history that you have been able to work with?
So I think this was just an extension of the oral histories, right? I think what I realized when, so initially we got funding through Mass Humanities, and the project, I was like, I'm going to tell new stories. Like, there's this history of Black folks in 1770 in this space that was then, Springfield or West Springfield at the time, that hadn't really been delved into too deeply. And over the course of the pandemic, I had a chance to look at, the history of the Fuller family and some of the other Black folks who were in the community here in Holyoke. But also in some of the work that I had done in Hadley, I realized that a number of the families that were Hadley families were also Holyoke families. And so I thought about what would it look like to follow folks from their points of origin into Holyoke, especially thinking about 18th and 19th century Holyoke. And when I was doing that work and I was working with Doug Griffin, who has provided so much to this project, I realized that there was so much that I knew about the people from the previous project, that was the oral histories, in Reliquary of Blackness, Chapter 1. And it hadn't been fully fleshed out, right? So I knew these folks because I've been working with them, for the past 6 or 7 years. But the community doesn't know who these folks are. And the community at large doesn't understand what these folks' contributions, many of them who are still living today or their descendants are still in this space today and working in Holyoke and for Holyoke and building, Black community here. And so it's just maybe we have to pause on going back further and really focus on the now, right? And, even thinking about VOC, right? In the history of VOC, that was CROP, that before that, they got their programs from AIM, which was the Association for the Advancement of Minorities. And it's well, we don't even understand that history for ourselves today, what that looks like. And so, I was just I have to go back to the drawing board and really zero in and focus in on the beautiful people that I love, the Black folks from Holyoke.
And this new focus on the now, on the present, that is so connected with this legacy and history, I think it's a perfect way to connect people with things that they are currently aware of, engaged with, and see their importance, their relevance, and how it all came from Black history that you have been working with for this past years to make sure that people get to learn more about it. To think about the impact of the Valley Opportunity Council and to think about how all those efforts came from organizations by the community, the Black community. Those happened because of that.
Right.
And it was something that possibly for many generations, completely unknown until you are making it more visible for everyone to learn about it. And it all happened here.
Right. And I think the beauty of it, too, is that this is grassroots, right? These are people from the community saying like, we have an issue here and we need to solve it, and we need to do that for ourselves, right? And I think that, again, thinking about VOC, right, Valley Opportunity Council, and the way that it stands now, it's like this organization that, you don't necessarily know the people who are at the top, right? But to understand like the possibility of just starting with people from your neighborhood, from your church, right? Seeing an issue and building on that, and being able to see the legacy of that history, right? That spans like over 50 years, I think further back than, 50 years, right? And so it just gives license to folks to say, like, I can do this, right? We can do it on our own. We don't have to look to other people necessarily to build it. And that you have, like, I always think about this idea of like a roadmap of like, literally, you don't have to figure it out on your own. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, because there is a history that's already laid out that we just don't know, because it's not, because it wasn't, prior to this project, like public knowledge.
During this work and research, you have been exposed and got the opportunity to meet people, mm-hmm. to see some objects, to read documents, to find documents. And as you mentioned, this last episode of this journey, mm-hmm. has been more about the interactions with people, mm-hmm. with elders who still have in their memories those moments, those facts, those even descriptions of places. Mm-hmm. How has it been for you to get exposed to that, to discover and to find more about this history, especially listening from the voices of people who lived through it?
Mm-hmm. I think it's always, so I love the archive, right? But I like to think about like the living archive, right? And that is in large part, the elders in the community, right? That like places like Liberty Park, right? Which was a public project apartment here in Holyoke, that it no longer exists, right? And for all intents and purposes, it only exists in the memories of, folks who lived there, folks who interacted with that space, right? And so I think that the beauty of just sitting down and talking to like the elders and saying like, for me, it was Doug, right? And Miss Diane McCullum, right? And Trudy, Miss Trudy, I'm able to look and say, what do you want to see these kinds of projects, this work look like, right? And not what do I like, because yes, there are things that I want to know, that I'm interested in. And also realizing that like the people from the community have an idea, like I said, Liberty Park, they knew it existed, right? But nowhere in the immediate archive was it, already kind of like fleshed out, right? And so I talked to Miss Diane because it's almost like, for lack of a better term, like gaslighting, right? Because you're saying to, Holyoke Housing, like this place existed because I lived there. But then they're like, we don't have any recollection or any records about this place, right? And then you go to the public library and it's like you find a couple of newspaper articles that kind of say, specific to Liberty Park, that it only existed for 2 years, right? But then Miss Diane says, no, because I lived there into the 50s, right? It was built in 44. I lived there until 1954, 55, right? And so I know that it existed. And so for me, then it's like, well, this is a place that's very integral to her life and her experience here in Holyoke, right? And again, for Doug as well, Doug Griffin as well. And so it's like, how do I then take these narratives that folks from the community are giving me and then find the evidence that corroborates their story, that other folks look at them and say, well, I don't remember that place. So if I don't remember, if we collectively in our memory don't remember it, then it didn't exist, right? And now you go into the archive or into the exhibit and you see like, no, this place existed. It existed for over 10 years. You know what I mean? Right on Appleton Street in Winter. And I think to your question, right? It's just a beautiful thing to be able to then work with the elders to, you know, to retrace history, right? Of this community that this landscape, this urban landscape, right? That had been like, I don't want to say intentionally disappeared, but it was definitely like a whole community of people were disappeared, right? In our collective consciousness. So I think just being able to like work with them and say, like, here's what you remember. Here's what, you know, the archives remember, right? Or what they have for us. And, you know, blending those together. And if you have a chance to go and visit the exhibit, one of the beautiful things is that I worked with Miss Diane McCullum, and we did a recreation, artistic rendering of Liberty Park, you know, in the two buildings that the majority of Black folks lived in, right? And so to see people from the community who lived there and interacted with that space to come in and like, we couldn't find any, you know, actual photos of it, but then for them to come in and see it and say, this is exactly what I remember, you know? And it then recalls all of these images for them too, and memories for them too. And I think that for me is like the most important, you know, aspect of doing this work.
And taking the importance of a place like Liberty Park when the documented history speaks a lot of the immigrations from Europe, mm-hmm. the immigrations from Canada, the immigrations from the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. But then there is almost nothing that documents this moment where the Black community was living in Holyoke. Mm-hmm. To the point that possibly this is the very first time many people are listening about Liberty Park mm-hmm. at all. So just to give a little glimpse of its relevance, its importance, mm-hmm. what it was Liberty Park. And I'm also curious about, it was because it was the only place that allowed Black people to live, mm-hmm. or it was, what was involved into that?
So Liberty Park was originally called Depot Hill Housing Project. It was a U.S., so a federal housing project, housing complex, right? That was initially developed and built for those folks who had migrated to Holyoke to work either at the military base, in the factories, and in infrastructure here in Holyoke. It's not the only of its kind. During World War II, a number of these housing projects were built across the country, again, to help with a housing crisis that's happening because folks are going off to the war and they're needing to replace them, again, in the factories and in infrastructure jobs, and again, also at military bases. And so you have civilian workers who are coming to this space that need housing. And so the government, I can't remember the name of the act, but, built this housing complex. And so what happens is it's, at that time, there are two other housing projects that are federal housing projects, but run by Holyoke Housing Authority. Lyman Terrace and Jackson Parkway. And so those two housing complexes didn't allow Black people to live there. And so there are all these cases that come up where people are like, it's discrimination. And Holyoke Housing Authority is like, it's not. We just don't have any applications from Black folks, right? But when you talk to the Black community, they're like, we did apply, and we were discouraged from applying. And even in the instance that people got beyond the application process, which was very rare, that people from the community, white folks who lived in those housing complexes, would let Black folks know, you don't want to live here because this isn't a place for you, right? And so what happens when Liberty Park is built is that a number of folks are coming from the South, and they're migrating here, again, to work in the factories and to work at the military base at Westover. And they're applying to live there. And so the Federal Housing Authority says to Holyoke, okay, so you all have to manage this, please and thank you. This is the first time in history, well, not in history, but the then director of Holyoke Housing, he says to the newspaper, he tells them this is the first time in 10 years that the folks on the board voted unanimously not to accept something or just to pass something, right? And they voted not to accept the management of Liberty Park, in part because a number of Black folks had applied to live there. And because it was a directly, federal housing project, there could be no discrimination, right? And so it's just really interesting to look at, because once the Federal Housing Authority takes over the management of Liberty Park, the woman that they had put in in charge of the management, she says to the newspaper, she says, so there are 44 units, apartments in the entire complex. They had 35 applications, right? So we're just looking for a few more, right? 9 more applications, we'll have a full house. And I expect that everybody will be accepted to move in, and we'll start folks moving in, in a couple of months. Again, this is 1943. She says to the newspaper, she's asked, well, can anybody apply? And she says, yes, regardless of color, they could be yellow, black, green, blue, red. They can move in here. The next day, when this is published in the newspaper, all the applications go away, except for there are some white folks who maintain, their residence or their application. But the majority of applicants completely just rescind their application to live in Liberty Park. So they go from having 35 potential people moving in, in a few months, to 0 applicants. Well, not 0 applicants. I think they had 4 or 5, right? And so there's this then this kind of push to be well, what do we do? Because the U.S. government is relying on the rent to pay the taxes and to pay, for utilities from Public Works, Holyoke Public Works, or what have you. And now they don't have enough people moving in. And so they start to think about new ways to attract people to living in the projects, opening it up then to military families who are, working at and stationed at Westover. But it's just this really interesting story of, this city, right, that is Holyoke, allowing these buildings that, taxpayers fought against because they said, we don't need any more public housing. We don't want it, going so far as to petition the state and the federal government to have it torn down. Telling them before it was even built, we don't want this here. The burden is gonna be on taxpayers, right? And we still hear this conversation now happening in Holyoke. And so it's just interesting that this thing happened. There was a need, right? But based on racist ideologies in this community, that Liberty Park suffered greatly, right? It was built only for temporary housing. It was supposed to be torn down at minimum 2 years after the war, the end of World War II. That didn't happen, and in large part because Holyoke had a housing crisis, right? And again, this is the only public housing in Holyoke that Black folks can live in, and the conditions are deplorable, right? Because pipes burst, wood swelled. Some of the appliances were rusted out, and it was so bad that there was a call to the federal housing authority that said, you have to come and look at this because we can't expect people to live here, right? And they still did. And Holyoke did the bare minimum actually, to get them to a place where they were inhabitable, right? And so, yeah, like the first Black family that was allowed to live, I think, at Lyman Terrace didn't happen until 1957, right? Right. And so you think about it, where like this should be public housing, this should have access. And even when the government gets to a point, you know, in 1953, I think they were like, we're going to tear this down. It has to go, right? Because it's a money pit for them, right? At one point, the Holyoke trash collection, you know, they stopped collecting trash at Liberty Park. So there's a newspaper article about that, where like residents are like, well, what do we do? And you're literally looking at piles and stacks of refuse, you know, in a space where the kids are supposed to be playing, right? And they can't because, you know, there's trash everywhere. And so it's just this really interesting moment that reflects a lot of, you know, housing crises not only in Holyoke, but also, you know, in a lot of urban centers. But, you know, when they get to that point where we're like, or, you know, the federal housing says, we're going to tear them down. We have to. There are a number of Black families who have, you know, the family size is anywhere between like 10 and 15, right? And the majority of them are kids. And so Holyoke, the mayor's office, and a few other, you know, Holyoke organizations, social workers or what have you, are like, well, we need to help these families. Like, you can't just put them out on the street. We need to help these families, you know, find a place to go. And it's really interesting because there's this story where actually the Smith family is trying to find housing in Holyoke. They have a social worker who's helping them trying to find housing. And the social worker goes to this apartment building and they say, you know, she's getting collecting applications from different places that have units available. And she goes to this one particular unit and the landlord says, well, who is this application for? And so she explains to him, you know, it's for this family, blah, blah, blah. And he says, oh, they're Black? Yeah, no, we don't accept applications from Black folks. This is for white folks and Polish, more specifically, Polish families only. And so it's like this moment of, you know, like, again, we know it happened, but to have it explicitly written out in, you know, in a newspaper, in a historical document, you know, is like, well, here it is, you know? And so, again, Liberty Park wasn't torn down until I believe May of 1955. And it's just this moment of like literal, like all the things you could think of that are wrong in Holyoke at this time, even contemporarily, right? Like all those things are playing out in this housing unit that is literally just been wiped off the face of Holyoke once it was demolished, you know? So, yeah.
To think that this events that happened over 60 years ago, and fortunately we have seen some changes happening ever since until where we are today in 2023, others barely changing, which is a great thing. Also, that reminder of when statements are made to the press, to the media, those become part of history. And yeah, time will tell if they were right or wrong on those statements, actions, thoughts, concepts. And the importance of this is because we should continue learning, and hopefully next generations will continue that process. And it is through the work that you do as a researcher that you're bringing to light many of these important and meaningful events in the history of the Black community and the community in Holyoke, on aspects that still today are relevant, are current, and they need some more work to be done. So how do you feel through this time during this whole project of Black Holyoke, and everything that you have learned and everything that you have accomplished through the interactions and the connections with people of the Black community?
I feel encouraged. Honestly, I feel like I always say, I didn't understand what the history here was. And I didn't understand, obviously before I started this project, like what the contributions of the folks in Holyoke were, not only to like local, but also national history, right? And so it makes me feel extremely encouraged. One, because I always think about like, how do we bring the past present for the future, right? So that future generations can look back and say, like, we have a place here, and this is our history, right? But also, I love this community, right? Like, I love these people, and I'm proud to say, like, this is my extended family, right? In the Westbrook family, in the Griffin family, in the Munson family, and in the McCullums, and others like the Kennedys and, the Danielses, like, this is my extended family, and this project means so much to not only me, but also like the elders who, historically haven't had their stories heard, haven't had them valued in a way that, you walk into this museum that is literally a museum to this white family who had money. And the first thing you see right now over the next month, or the next few weeks is, Black folks in Holyoke, right? And if that's not placemaking, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know what is, because they walk in and they know, like, it's good to know that I'm important to myself, right? But to walk into a space like that and to have your stories revered, not only by yourself and your family, but a larger community, has brought folks to tears, you know what I mean? Because it's like, we're important. We're important beyond the stories that we tell our grandkids. Like, we're important for a whole community of people because of the work that we've done and the ways that we've committed our lives to this, right? That otherwise would not have been told, And for some instances, like, Selena Griffin, who, passed away in I think 1966, her story is still being told today, right? And I think that that's so valuable. That we can understand this Tuskegee Institute graduate came here to Holyoke, right, from Georgia, and had her, had such an impact, on the city, potentially on, presidents, you know what I mean? And that I can tell her story, that Doug can tell her story, that Doug's grandchildren can tell her story and take pride in, this is my ancestor, right? And that anyone in Holyoke can take her story and see it for what it is and take pride in, being from this place and being from these people.
What an amazing journey, experience, and legacy you are making with this project of Black Holyoke. How can people get to enjoy of this particular exhibit that you have at Wistariahurst, being the Reliquary of Blackness Chapter 2?
So the Reliquary of Blackness Chapter 2 will be on display at Wistariahurst Museum at 238 Cabot Street here in Holyoke until October 10th. Right now, the open hours are Monday, 10 to 12 p.m., 10 a.m. to 12 p.m., and on Tuesdays from 4:30 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. And if folks want to see it outside of those hours, I would just implore you to contact the museum and see if there are any other times that you could visit the space.
And about your work, what is happening, what it will be continue happening with your research and more pieces and stories to collect?
So right now I'm working on doing like a podcast about the history here and working in conjunction with Mass Humanities and New England Public Media, as well as the Black folks from Holyoke. And hopefully you all here too at Holyoke Media on telling the stories through the perspectives of, my research, but with the undertone of community members, own words of what their experiences were. And also Reliquary of Blackness will be my dissertation and hopefully a book coming out soon. But yeah, my hope for a future, Doug asked me a couple of weeks ago, he says, well, when's chapter 3 coming out? And I think I think Eric Vega said it best, recently over the summer, is that, he said, I opened the book, right? And now we want to give opportunity from people from the community to take this up. And so I'm really encouraged by the youth at the Holyoke Ethnic Studies program. They've been in the archive and they've been digging through things. They actually have an exhibit opening this Friday, October 6th at Wistariahurst. But I'm hoping that folks will be encouraged by these stories and that they'll continue, particularly youth, but also elders in the community, right, to think about ways that we can continue to build this. Because again, while I came into this just wanting to know everything that I could about Black folks, that a lot of the ways that things have kind of shaped themselves or been shaped is by people in the community of what they would like to see, of what stories should be told. And so, yeah, I look forward to working with the community to build the next chapter of this project.
Well, Erika, this whole journey and experience and seeing those different moments where those accomplishments have been going on through this past years is such a joy and such pride, because you are really creating an important legacy of putting chapters of the lost history, missed history of Holyoke that are important and necessary for future generations to know about, to understand, and to integrate to the whole view of the people who make Holyoke today what it is.
Yeah. And I hope that, I think back when I first started the project in 2017, Doug showed me a documentary that had been done on the history of Holyoke. And the snippet that was less than 5 minutes, right, in this hours long, documentary, only barely scratched the surface of Black history. And so when we think about and we talk about the integration, right, is that this is what I want to see, is that our story is woven into the history of Holyoke, not as a supplemental, well, here's also what was going on over here. Is that no, we built this town, right, this city, right? It was Black folks who built it here, and I know we can say that about almost any place, but here specifically, it is Black folks who build the churches. It is Black folks who start to build the education systems and things like that, and really are the ones that are advocating for themselves, to have a better life and have better opportunities and experiences here. And I think that when we get so far away from it and so far removed, that we forget that, I don't want to say we own this, but we have a chapter in this history, right, that needs to be told and not just glossed over, because it is so intertwined with the history of this space and all of the other stories that I think have been told and retold and are being told now, or learned now. And that's what I really want to see, is this meshing of, the narrative of this place that isn't supplemental, but is, is woven in.
Well, Erika, thank you so much for this time talking about the Reliquary of Blackness Chapter 2, but also for all your work during these years and your commitment to bring history to life and keep it alive.
Thank you, Johan.